But Dickens did like theater and maintained that interest throughout his life. Because his novels were published serially, he created a kind of special relationship with his readers. His novels would bring people together in a kind of literal way. Until the 1870 Education Act, which really expanded literacy in England, most people couldn't read, and so people would get together and one person would read out loud Dickens's novel. So he's creating these kind of experiences for people, what Malcolm Andrews calls synchronized communal readings for tens of thousands of people, the way he's publishing his novels. But in 1858, Dickens does them one better, and he starts going on reading tours, reading his own novels out loud for the public. He drew, again, crowds of thousands of people. His final readings were in St. James Hall, which is this picture. And so you can see how big the crowds were that Dickens is talking to. Everyone wanted to hear him read. And one of his favorite readings to perform was Sikes and Nancy. Dickens excerpted the sections from Oliver Twist, starting with Nancy's sort of secret meeting with Oliver's family, leading up to her murder, and then Sykes sort of being chased down, and his death in front of an angry mob. There were no microphones in Victorian England. There were no sound systems. And so Dickens would have had to fill that whole space with just his voice. He was a famously active performer. Some of his reading texts still exist. He would sort of pound on the podium, mimicking the death scene for Nancy. He was not a young man by the 1860s, and the readings sort of took a lot out of him physically. By the end, he was traveling with a physician for all of his readings in case he collapsed on stage. And lots of his biographers actually read this as kind of doing Dickens in. He died of a stroke in 1870, possibly because he was taking so much out of himself with these performances. So there's a way then of thinking about Dickens' life story, beginning and ending with Oliver Twist. Begins with the novel, right? Same year Victoria comes to the throne, his first planned novel, and then ends with his readings of Sikes and Nancy. So part of the reason Dickens is giving all these public readings is financial. He's supporting his wife and his mistress and his father and his kids, and so although he's making a lot of money, he's still constantly financially strained. But he was also really interested in continuing that relationship that he had started building with the serial publication. And so Malcolm Andrews, who studies Dickens' readings, says that Dickens is exceptional in wanting not just celebrity, but also friendship, personal affection, a permanent place in people's lives, and a corner in their homes. And so I would suggest that Dickens, in this sense, finds a kind of 20th century analog in Walt Disney, who, through the medium of television, would find a sort of more literal place in corners of people's homes. And this persona of Uncle Walt could be compared to the persona Dickens is trying to get to in his public readings. There are several other ways. We can think about Walt as a 20th century Dickens. That there is no Charles Dickens Company is probably an accident of history. Dickens just died before he could take advantage of that. But both Dickens and Disney promoted themselves through their work, consciously engineering their sort of public profile, taking advantage of new media, so serial publication or television. Both were also child performers. I mentioned Dickens's interest in child theater, and Walt put on performances of Peter Pan as a kid after he saw a production. So I've put up the years of Disney's birth and death. So we see that year again, 1901. So the year Queen Victoria dies is the year that Walt Disney is born. But I do want to say that there is a connection between Walt Disney and the Victorians. I teach at Rollins, and in the spring I taught a class on Disney's Victorians, where we looked at Victorian text that the Disney company adapted. It's where my interest in this stuff began. Disney produced 16 films between 1937, which was Snow White, the first full-length animated feature, and 1955, by which time he's really thinking about Disneyland. About 3/4 of those films are related to Victorian texts published during the Victorian period. So this probably has a little bit of something to do with the post-war interest in the Victorians, but I'm suggesting it also has a lot to do with Walt Disney himself. His daughter, Diane Disney Miller, says that Mother and Dad both loved the Victorian period. Earlier this summer, I spent some time in the Disney archives. One of the things I learned was the amount of research that went into those early films. Disney writers would look at theater adaptations, they would look at other films, they would read academic scholarship on things like Alice in Wonderland. So Disney is reading some of the same scholars that I've cited in my own work. So it's that emphasis that leads me to start thinking about the adaptation history of Oliver Twist. Dickens is interested in theater. His novel is on the stage before it's even finished. And I made this connection between Dickens's novel and the illustrations, and then the stage versions and tableau and realizations, thinking about that as a kind of predecessor to motion pictures. And then we can think about Dickens's public readings, and the way that Nancy, as the novel gets adapted, plays a larger and larger role, both in the stage performances and in Dickens's readings. And then we remember that the stage performances are musicals, and that there's a subgenre of dog melodrama. So given all that, it should make perfect sense to have a cartoon musical, Oliver Twist with dogs. So I have one last anecdote before I finish. Charles Dickens had a house guest in 1857. Dickens had just moved in with his family, including his wife and 8 of his children. His guest had planned to stay for 2 weeks, but ended up staying for 5 weeks. Dickens, during this time, was working on The Frozen Deep, this is the play where he meets Ellen Ternan, with whom he goes on to have an affair. So by the end of 5 weeks, Dickens and his family are really sick of this house guest. His children call him the most boring man alive. That visitor was Hans Christian Andersen, who, of course, you know, wrote The Ugly Duckling, The Emperor's New Clothes. And if you recall from the beginning of my talk, that meeting in 1985, 3 ideas were pitched to Disney. One of them was Treasure Island in Space, which of course would be made eventually. And the other one was The Little Mermaid, which is a story by Hans Christian Andersen, published, coincidentally, in 1837, so same year as Oliver Twist, same year Victoria becomes queen. The Little Mermaid, you probably know, is a Disney movie. It's actually the Disney movie that immediately follows Oliver and Company. And it's with that movie that the Disney Renaissance begins. Howard Ashman worked on Oliver and Company, and then with The Little Mermaid, he would be joined by Alan Menken. Disney would start thinking of their films as Broadway musicals. Beauty and the Beast was nominated for Best Picture, and The Little Mermaid and Aladdin and The Lion King all won Academy Awards for Best Original Song. And for Disney, this all begins with Oliver and Company. And so we can think of Disney's Renaissance beginning in the 1830s with adaptations of Dickens's novel before it's even finished. Of course, Disney won another Academy Award for Best Original Song. And so I'll end my talk there, about as recent as we can get. Frozen, if you didn't already know, adapts another Hans Christian Andersen story, The Snow Queen. And so as recently as last year, Disney is still thinking about the Victorian period as they make their animated movies. Thanks.